You are not who you thought you were. Something that's always surprised me, I guess, since I really became cognizant myself, is how little curiosity people who I've known have displayed about who they are, who and what they are. There seems to be this tendency for us to just accept everything at face value, to accept the things around us and our thoughts and feelings as if these things are all hardwired together, as if what we are experiencing is the givens of existence. But instead, we do have certain genetic tendencies that have been passed down to us through ages. And something that people don't really realize is that the main thing that has been passed down to us is a lot of strengths. We are the children of survivors, and we are the ones who were clever and hung on, the ones who withstood, the ones who got by. Every one of us has a lot of really amazing stuff hardwired into themselves. And of course, there's a lot of other parts of our hardwiring that don't make life super convenient. Anxiety, stress, fears that just really don't belong in the cognizant world. Our brain is not just one organ that's sitting there doing one thing. We want to pretend that our brain is the device where we are, but there really is no brain, so to speak. It's a handy name for a collection of neurons that are happening in your head, but these are made up of all kinds of different modules that grew up over different times and different millennia for different reasons to get us through different challenges. And they build on top of each other and don't always agree. And all of this is put together by this little narrating part of one side of our brain, which tells us a story more or less in the language in which we were brought up about what we are thinking, about what we are feeling, about what we want, about our surroundings. It turns all of these stimuli cohesive. Meanwhile, the brain is fighting to keep stimuli out. It's fighting, it's a filter to make sure that you are not overwhelmed by all the information that's coming into you all the time. Through your skin, through your ears, through your eyes, through your nose, everything is bringing in information that must be filtered out so that your little tiny radar self can look out and around and decide what is important and what is not. Besides our genetic tendencies, we are all the product of thrownness. That is the time and place where we are born. Our environment will help us decide to what extent our different genetic traits take shape. So, for example, you're born with way too many neurons, like way too many possible axons, way too many connections in your head that anybody could possibly handle and that would ever be necessary for navigating a single environment. You're loaded for bear. You come in with a full set of tools in your brain that are not going to be needed. And very quickly, when you start using different neural pathways in your mind, when you start treading down trails over the weeds, creating riverbeds where once it was just flat land, that's how our neurons then begin to grow together. And we start sending electrical impulses that are connected through two sugars across different neurons, and they change shape so that we can just absorb so much of the world around us. So that you're speaking by age 5 about 80% of the words that you're going to use for the rest of your life. And all of those extra neurons, the ones that aren't used, the ones that don't get trampled down, the ones that do not match the conforming nature of our environment, that do not get used in order to socialize with other people and navigate our space, begin to die off. We kill those things off and limit ourselves to something that is more adept to our specific environments. Now, it may be interesting to note that not everybody kills them off the same way, and this is why we get things like autism and even savantism, where there are parts of the brain that continue being used despite the fact that any sort of a typically wired person would have decided that this network of neurons is not necessary. And many autistics, if you do a brain scan, they have what's called the convoluted neuron network, which is a bunch of neurons that don't make sense to the medical eye because they aren't present in, 97% of the brains that they look at. Another thing that's limiting to this neuroplasticity is ADHD, for example, where certain chemical rewards are not presented to this individual that would help to train them to think in certain ways. That those little rewards that come after expected behaviors that, again, match the demands of the environment do not get given. So the brain doesn't quite mold to that environment either. Anyway, those are neurodivergence, and of course there's lots of different versions of neurodivergence, and we can get into that at some point, but that's not really what we're talking about today. It's a little bit of a hyperfixation of mine, being autistic and ADHD and dyslexic. I've been researching it a lot, so forgive me. But it's important to note that it is our environmental factors that help these things even take shape, that many people who would be genetically driven towards something like ADHD, born into the 21st century American environment, are much more likely to begin to display traits that match that diagnosis because of the strange nature of the dopamine rewards in the environment in which we were born. So we are not born a tabula rasa. We have different genetic propendencies, and then we also are over-equipped and begin to trim around and modify ourselves to match our environmental needs. This is called being socialized. As you can probably imagine, our socialization is super powerful. If you're walking around and you consider yourself a man, and you're into like men's things, and you're going to sports ball, or if you have spent a lot of money on makeup lately and you consider yourself a woman and you walk around doing lady stuff, I don't know, I've seen Barbie, it was cool. They do stuff too. Yeah, you were socialized into that role. You were told a story over and over about who you are. And this started before you were born for most of you. They have these gender reveal parties. And right there at the gender reveal party, they release a set of expectations that this unborn child is going to want to meet if they're going to be rewarded properly by their environment. And they're going to be pushed and pushed until their neural pathways create little tiny treads over those weeds and create paths that say woman, create paths that say man. Now, this socialization doesn't always take for everybody, and again, we're talking about variations from the norm, but it seems like it's important to point those out because the very variations really push the narrative of normalcy. They really show you what is possible if you stepped a couple of those standard deviations away from the bell curve. But the normal thing is to be socialized into one gender or another, and then to be socialized with certain values that are reflected in your sort of subsect of humanity. Certain values that might have to do with food or music, or it might have to do with sports, it might have to do with work life and your whole notion of what is important in the world. Culturally, we share one sort of really big story that's told to us all the time. This is a story about a country. It has these imagined borders where we literally protect and it has a sort of imagined like personality, and people are in charge of it, and all these other little things. And as long as we're all pretending at the same time, it works out really well, so far as having a country is concerned. But there are certain cultural expectations that are built into this fiction. These certain cultural expectations, not all of them got there on accident. Many were quite on purpose, or many that may have arrived by accident were perpetuated on purpose for lots of different reasons. I guess a good example is in the 1800s when Christmas began to be pushed as a big family holiday in America, where it had been something of a drunken mess in Europe for several, 100 years, and was outlawed in England for a while for that reason, and then was sort of repackaged with a nice consumer drift to it and a togetherness sort of spirit that was hoping to create more of an American identity, as you had a country that they felt was just sort of Play-Dohed together from lots of different ethnicities and personalities, and, to varying degrees of freedom and success, of course. But even within that context, even within the larger context of our country and our culture, we have these little smaller cultures that spring up, these little different ways in which we are socialized, in which we begin to collectively create normalcy of reality, and in which we begin to mold our values and expectations and what we see as legitimate in the world. This is powerful. I keep hammering that in, but I think that it bears the continued hammering. This is powerful. Just think about your language. Again, this is socialized learning. Language is very, very learnable because the information with language comes at you that is nested and recursive. That is, the words have meaning within them and they keep coming around again. And as that happens, we begin that process of learning through socialization because it's nested and recursive. I love that. And if we can do this with language, we do it with so much more. We do it with belief. We do it with identity. We do it with senses of belonging, ethics, right and wrong. I mean, that's massive. There is no one thing that was ever deemed so wrong by people that it was wrong in every single culture. Think of the things that are illegal now, the things that we consider wrong, and just know that at one point or another there was a culture that completely stood by those things. Yes, murder, rape, incest. Nothing was so revolting as to be left out of every single society. I mean, even in the United States, we have ceremonialized murder in most states, where we've granted our state the power to take our lives should we mess up a little too much. Now, yeah, this is a cynical view, but it's a cynical view because I think that it's really easy to see all of the good that has sprung up from this system. I think it's really easy to see the advantages of speaking a language, the advantages of communication, the advantages of socialization. The way we cooperate is amazing. The way that we are wired to cooperate is fantastic. Something that I teach in my zombie class, yes, I teach a zombie class, is that the zombie apocalypse would never happen in the ways that movies depict. In movies, most of the time, there's zombies, and that's scary, and people are running away, and the zombies are either slow or else then they're fast, because we got bored of slow ones or whatever. And they ultimately find that the real enemy is the other people. That there's these people, and they're armed up, and they're ready to go, and they're going to take your resources, and you want to take their resources, and you fight amongst yourselves, and the zombies become a sort of convenient backdrop for this infighting, and these different ideals of government and rule and right and wrong begin to take shape in a sort of microcosm among this zombie apocalypse land. It's exciting, but it's not how it would work out. How it would work out is people would start cooperating. People would start building. Those people down the street from you who are, doomsday preppers and they have their basement full of all sorts of like dry goods and ammunition and stuff, those dudes will start sharing with you. No joke. They think that they're going to go out there and hoard it for themselves, but when it goes down, they will be cooperating like everybody else because it is in our genes. Because if it wasn't going to work out that way, it wouldn't be working out that way now. Yes, we have conflict now. Yes, we have divided beliefs, but we're doing it within this sort of perceived safety of our social construction, where it's okay for us to fight about things like book bans and drag queens in some level because we feel that there is a certain safety net that's protecting us from falling apart in such a way like that. And of course, this is exactly some of the manipulation I'm talking about when it comes to socialization. Exactly the kind of thing that we can convince people something is right, something is wrong, something is universally bad, something is universally good. And there's nothing more absurd than that. The absurdity is that you have religious people practicing what they believe is a 2,000-year-old religion that is mostly 10 years old, 20 years old, 50 years old tops. That it has changed so much, that things have evolved so much, that it's nothing like these older religions. And I'm talking about all of them. Thank you. Yes, there are some sorts of ideals or practices or ceremonies or rituals that we can keep in place. There's words that people wrote that we can keep saying over and over again. But listen, when a farmer is down on his luck, he goes out and buys an irrigation system. They don't pray for rain anymore. The very people who argue against vaccination are the people who were saved from polio, from smallpox. The very people who take ibuprofen when they have a headache. We do not practice our faiths the way they used to be practiced, flat out. It changes with the times. Our environment insists upon it. If those traditions are to last at all, they're going to have to change. And so it goes. My point is that our culture has decided much for you. That before you were born, many of the decisions about meaning in your life, about what you would want to be when you grow up, about what is good and what is bad, were decided for you and told to you. And this isn't necessarily, a complete lack of freedom and autonomy. It's okay to play in the same sandbox with everybody else to some extent. If we didn't play in the same sandbox, we wouldn't have cool stuff like buildings and, artificial burgers and stuff. Those are the two things I picked out. Buildings and artificial burgers. Wow. We play in the same sandbox by way of nature, but we are told a story of individuality by our culture, of individuality and expression, then that is, of course, tainted and pushed around and made different depending on which subsect of the culture you're in, but none of whom are telling you who you really are. They're telling you who you should be. For the most part, you're listening. So what I want to examine right now, we're going to take a deep dive this next season of talks here. We're going to take a deep dive into popular culture. And what we're going to do is examine the ways that our popular culture has molded our ideas of self, our ideas of community, our ideas of so many things in our world. And we're going to look at the extent to which this was on purpose, this was on accident, and then run with real hard, etc. Popular culture is fascinating and new. It is not something that existed before. It is something that is a result of the speed up of culture that started happening after World War II. And it gets faster and faster and faster all the time. I once read something to the extent that if you took all of the information ever created, all of the songs, all of the books, every single piece of human created culture, and you took it from the dawn of time to around 2003, and you called that one unit of human creation, let's say, dawn of time to 2003, then you were to compare it to the type of the same level of information being created now since 2006 or so when YouTube came out, you're creating about one unit every 3 days. Every 3 days. And dude, that's an out of date statistic because I've been saying it for 4 or 5 years. So no doubt we're to the point where everything created between the dawn of time and 2003 is probably being created every half day or so. Beats me. I would look it up, but I don't even know how to start. And I'm fascinated enough as it is, so let's present this one as fact. This means that there really is a speed up. There really is a way that information is changing place. You have better access to information than anybody has ever had before you. And for the most part, this has not been empowering. For the most part, this has been somewhat terrifying. And there's all kinds of things we can blame it on, and we blame it on school, and we blame it on, what else do we blame it on besides school? I think we just blame it on school. But dude, there's a lot of forces at play, and most of them are not school. Yes, school is an amazing force of popular culture, and it is more and more being bought and paid for and pushed around by those same forces that brought you, the Backstreet Boys and Britney Spears or whatever. I'm a modern guy. But it's not nearly as powerful in socialization. It's so much more. For the most part, we're going to be talking about the world that you inhabit every day. We're going to be talking about the world where you exist, your experiences. Because bringing your experiences into this is how you're really going to learn anything at all. Bringing your experiences into this, connecting with those axons and neurons that you already have working up there, is the only real way to build out into the real understanding of new information. Trust me, I've got a doctorate of education. I've got this. So starting out, the very probably most influential presence that we have in our popular culture, the most important part that which without everything would crumble, is advertising. Advertising is one of the most powerful forces throughout history. You take every single king and queen and monarch and leader and dictator throughout history who's pushed things around to what they wanted things to be. They don't come close to what advertising has managed. Yes, there is not one brain behind advertising, and that's a bit of a problem, but there is one goal behind advertising, which is to get money to flow uphill. It's amazingly effective at that. It's amazingly effective at changing our definitions of ourselves until we have built a new meaning in our lives that is to produce money for people who have lots of money already and have paid for advertising. We adopt this culture so readily because it brings us so much pleasure and joy and necessity that we all sort of need right now. It makes the intangible real to us. So we tend to not question it. Popular culture is really a big advertising game. You have music, television, and movies, sports, and, it's impossible to really throw the internet in as popular culture. Social media is certainly a big part of it, and social media is a fantastic place to exchange information and misinformation. Um, Super powerful force. We'll try talking about that, but I mean, that's kind of like talking about the ocean by going and scooping out some water with a teaspoon and putting it in a cup and saying, "See, this is the ocean. There aren't any waves." Something like that. But to really look at these forces and really start deconstructing the ways in which we have changed our definitions of reality to match them, we can begin to sort of deconstruct much of the world around us, which to me is super necessary. I do not see how anybody plans on growing or learning at all without deconstructing, without unlearning. Unlearning is quite simply the only way to learn. You have been taught so much. You have been told so many stories. You cannot compare the amount of stories that you have heard to the amount of stories that, a caveman would have heard 50,000 years ago over the course of his lifetime. It's insane how many stories you've been told, from like micro stories in social media and commercials to stories in television where everything's always happily ever after and everything comes up nice. Um, the type of socialization that has provided is insanity. And really, we are hardwired for stories. We are hardwired to hear a story and understand it as a representation of the world and our expectations. That is why somebody can look at a mass of statistics and still be swayed by an anecdote. You can get really learned people into a room together, and you can have them talk about a new plan or a new idea, and they can show you the research as to why this is great or why this would be terrible. And somebody can raise their hand and say, yeah, but this one time in this one condition, when this exceptional thing happened and that exceptional thing happened, this wouldn't have applied. And that whole group will just turn against all that research. It's wild. I've seen it happen so many times. And if I've seen it happen as a college professor, you can bet that there are tons of people in the legislature and government who have seen it happen in much worse ways. It's amazing that we have such great access to information, such amazing ability to create information through our curiosities and studies, and we have this whole like science thing down pretty well, where we can like at least screw up in ways that are conducive to learning. And that none of that seems to matter in how we live our lives. That we're incapable of stepping up and saying, hey, this certain politician's idea here is not only stupid, but very destructive and violent and will be ending lives. And people won't listen to that because they'll hear an anecdote. And that anecdote will instill just enough fear and just enough notions of like right and wrong to them that speaks to some sort of weird childhood belief that they were raised with, that they have created their meaning around and their value and their sense of themselves. So they won't listen to the research. They'll go, no, 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 no. This anecdote's right. We're scared. Ban drag queens from reading books. Because that's the problem in the world. It's amazingly powerful. And very much we got here from studying the power of advertising and propaganda, and it's been no mistake. It has not been on accident that this study has come up from mainly how to control people. People don't talk enough about how Hitler studied the Jim Crow laws to help him solidify his power, to drive fear, to drive control, to drive ostracizing the marginalized even further, so that the powerful people would solidify their ability to control things. And of course, Jim Crow laws came from all sorts of other just nasty inventions during the slave era and everything. And of course, I say the slave era as if it's over. We actually have more slaves alive on the world right now than we have ever had in history. The slave trade just isn't as obvious anymore, but way more people in bondage than I've ever been. And if you count prisoners in the United States, it gets really sickening too. But okay. So, this subject of popular culture is much more than wasn't Leave It to Beaver fun and look how different Friends is from Last of Us. It has so much to do with the way we live our lives and how we see ourselves. So come with me. This is going to be fun, even though I sound really sour right now.